Welcome to the Tuesday edition of Juan's World, and you'll see pictured here some cilantro, because I had originally intended to do what's called green curry in Southeast Asia. It's called green because it is green, and one of the things that makes it green is cilantro. The other thing is green chilies. But I'm not able to get cilantro right now, and so I can't make the curry. Well, that's actually not entirely true. I can use green curry paste, which is what I normally use. I don't normally make it from scratch. Unlike with other curries, with most Indian curries, I do make them from scratch. I don't use powders or pastes for the most part. I use a paste for vindaloo, but not for the other curries. I prefer to blend them myself. So one of these days I will get round to showing you how to make green curry from scratch. But today I thought I would talk about cilantro. It's an interesting herb. It's one that some people just love and some people absolutely hate. My sister absolutely hates it. And I used to actually dislike it myself, but I came to like it. And it's a really curious taste, because I discovered that there's a great deal of psychological investigation concerning the taste of cilantro, because it has to do with what people think of when they think of the taste is really the smell. What they think of when they taste or smell cilantro. And people who think, oh, yummy, 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 so my guacamole is really redolent of cilantro, and others say, oh, it tastes like soap. And the thing is that's the key to whether people like it or not. It's not the, if you can call it absolute taste. I don't know if that's a correct way of thinking about it. It's what the smell or the taste is associated with in people's minds. And so you can actually break their distaste of the herb if you get them to realign what they're associating it with. And that led me to thinking about the whole concept of nature versus nurture, which is it's a non-debate, and I will talk about that in a little while. But do we do things because they are built in, hardwired? Like, is my sister's dislike of cilantro hardwired in her genes? Or is it learned? And that then leads me on to the question of what we do because it's built into our systems, innate if you like, and what we learn. And it's a very curious and complicated debate, which we can get into. We can begin with a relatively simple look at the physiology of taste itself as a way of getting started. And you may have been taught things that are sort of true, sort of not true, when you were studying biology in school, or maybe just from the media. That is, you're probably told that you have 4 taste buds, and those taste buds are salty, sweet, sour, and bitter. And maybe you were also given a map of the tongue. If I can find a version of it, I'll put it up here, showing the location of those taste buds. Well, this is not the whole story, and some of it is just plain wrong. The distribution of the taste buds is completely wrong. The salty, sweet, sour, bitter taste buds are distributed over the entire tongue. And there's a fifth one. It's called umami. It's a Japanese name because it was originally discovered by a Japanese chemist who was interested in why it was that a soup that his sister had made was particularly flavorful. And she talked about how she'd used a certain kind of seaweed in the soup. And he went off to his lab and started analyzing the contents of the seaweed and ended up discovering monosodium glutamate, which then became sold. He created a company. He patented the method for extracting MSG from seaweed, and I think eventually how to produce it industrially without using seaweed, just by chemical processes. Anyway, MSG became a popular component of Japanese and then Chinese and all Asian foods, and in itself became a very controversial subject, which I don't want to get into in any detail, but there was a lot of talk at one time about how it was very bad for you, and there were programs that I remember watching in the 1960s about how MSG caused a certain kind of headache and whatnot. Well, the headache part is partially true. If you douse food in enough MSG, that you'll get a certain tightening in the temples. But otherwise, there's no evidence that it's bad for you. And in fact, in many countries that I've visited, including Vietnam, they have MSG shakers, like salt shakers, on the table. So you just add a little extra umami if you want to. So we've got 5 taste buds, as far as we know. We may have more. And they're distributed evenly over the tongue. The vast bulk of our tasting is actually smelling. That the aromas of the food that are on your tongue go up into your nose, where there are multiple receptors. In fact, biochemists don't even know how many receptors there are. It's not like color, where you can reduce everything down to 3 primary colors and you can make all the colors of the world from those 3 primary colors. We don't even know what the primary receptors are, how they combine, how they work. But we do know that the vast bulk of tasting is actually smelling. And one of the simple tests of this is to hold your nose blindfolded and taste different things, and you'll find that they taste bland. You can't tell the difference between certain things based on taste because your nasal receptors have been blocked. Or simply, if you have a very heavy cold and you have a lot of mucus in your nose, then it covers the receptors so that you can't taste much, and everything tastes bland when you have a heavy cold. All right, so that's the physiology of taste in brief. One of the curious things also about taste is that there are certain tastes that are used by physiologists to test the abilities of participants in experiments. And some tastes are diagnostic. Like there's some tastes that some people can smell and taste, right, and some people can't. And this is genetic. There's a particular gene that if you don't have it, you can't taste this particular thing, and if you do have it, then you can. So we can say that taste and smell have a genetic component. Where they don't have a genetic component is whether you like a particular taste and smell or not. That has to do with learning. So, for example, we probably innately like sweet things, to our downfall, and maybe innately do not like sour or bitter things. It may be that evolutionarily that's one of the reasons we have those distinct taste buds, is to be able to put something in our mouths and decide whether it's bitter, sour, or sweet. And in general, that's not such a bad thing, because a lot of poisons are bitter and sour, whereas ripe fruit are sweet. You know, so that if you are wandering, some kind of primitive forager wandering in an unknown area, and you spot a beautiful fruit hanging from a tree, and you take a bite, and it's bitter, you say, don't want it. Well, that's probably a good thing, because it may not be bitter, poisonous, but it could be, and so that's a simple way where, like, people who enjoyed bitter things died a lot and didn't pass their genes on to the next generation, whereas people who just spent their time eating sweet things did. Disadvantageous in the modern world, because refined sugar, which is hyper sweet, is going to do some serious damage to your body if you consume it too much. But anyway, that basic distinction between sweet and sour, certainly innate, and maybe the like of one and not the other may have an innate component. But the thing is that we can learn to like sour and bitter things. Generally speaking, younger children are put off by the sour and bitter end of the spectrum, but they can adjust. They can learn to like these things over time if they have the right associations. And of course, you know, the common associations, let's say, between sour and food and sweet and food in a lot of, like, English households would be, like, here is a salad. We can put vinegar on it with oil, and you can say this association is good. Salad plus sour, okay. But if I put ice cream in your dish and it's sour, then you're going to say, no, I don't want this. I want sweet associated with ice cream. Although you can change that too. You can have not necessarily ice cream so much, but sorbets. You can make sorbets that go with a main course that can be a little bit sour or a little bit bitter, because they are kind of your, one of your vegetables, if you like. And if you can associate it with being a vegetable, then you can say, okay, I that's That's good. So a lot of our adult likes and dislikes when it comes to food are built on learning. There is a genetic component and there is a learned component. And how those two come together is maybe unique to you. It's individual perhaps, or it could be social as well. But it's something that develops over time. Which leads me on to the general point that I wanted to make, that there is no debate when it comes to behavior in general as to whether this behavior is nature or nurture. That is, whether it's built into your genes or whether you learned how to do it. The simple fact is that it's always both. It's always partly innate, partly genetic, and partly learned. Learning a language as a child is this way. We all have an innate mechanism for learning language. And it's a good job we do, and that we don't need to take lessons for our native language, because if we did, a lot of us wouldn't ever learn language. But we have a genetic component that turns on at a certain point and allows us to acquire a language. And unfortunately, it turns off at some point as well. But which particular language we learn is entirely dependent on environment. It has nothing to do with genes. If you take a newborn infant born in Germany and is adopted by parents in Japan at birth, it'll grow up speaking fluent Japanese. It won't have an English accent. It won't start craving fish and chips or what have you. How the language acquisition, how the cultural acquisition occurs is entirely learned based on what the genes have instructed the brain to do at a certain time. So they're intertwined. So when it comes to the nature versus nurture debate, I have to write this over and over and over again in my current writing. I always write, usually in italics and capital letters, there is no debate. The issue is not whether something is innate or learned. It's a question of what the proportions are and what can be done about it. And this is the most important part also, that it doesn't matter what behavior is largely innate. Our genes can always be overridden. We can always do things that are contrary to what our genetic makeup requires of us. And again, there are simple examples. I mean, you can't look at a hermit who's lived alone in a cave for 20 years and say social behavior is not genetic. It is genetic. We are social animals, and being social is built into us. But it's not all social. Not all genetic. We have that tendency to be social, but we can go against it. We can learn to do the opposite. So the question that I have been raising in my writing quite recently is one that I can't answer right now, but I'll pose it to you as my final point of view. I don't know which one I should focus on exactly. We'll say sharing. Are humans genetically inclined towards sharing, or do they have to learn it? Well, From an evolutionary point of view, I would be inclined to believe that there is some genetic component, because a group of people who live together and who live on plants and animals that they kill or gather, what we call foragers, used to be called hunters and gatherers. That is, they don't have any domesticated plants and animals. Tendency is for a group to be able to live in a band of about 100. And their best mode of survival is sharing, because when the people, often men but not always, sometimes it's women as well, go hunting, some will come back with meat and some will come back without it. And if you have a rule in that culture that says if you kill an animal you get to eat meat that day, and if you don't kill an animal you get to eat none, then you're not going to be a very stable band, stable culture. If, on the other hand, you have a rule that says whenever you bring home meat, you share it with people who don't have any, then you have a much more stable situation, because that means that every time you go out, everyone eats. Now, it may be that the person who actually killed an animal gets more or the better part or something like that, but everyone gets something. Everyone gets their protein every time there is a hunt, and that's going to create a more stable situation. So there's a good case to be made that primitive hunters and gatherers had some kind of instinct towards sharing that helped in their survival, and the ones who didn't have that instinct didn't survive. That would be an evolutionary argument. It's not a very strong one, but it's reasonable. And that when you move away from hunting and gathering, you move away from a need to share things. And that leads to my even more general proposition, which is, do people like sharing in general, and if so, why, and if not, why not? Because this is really the fundamental distinction between people on the left wing of politics and people on the right wing of politics. If you want to boil it down to real basics, the people on the left think that sharing is good for the whole society, just like sharing meat among hunters and gatherers is good for the whole society. And on the right wing are people who say, I don't want to share. I want to keep what I produce, and I don't care about anybody else. That's the fundamental distinction, and it's not one you can argue about. You can't go up to somebody and say, I'm going to try to convince you to share as opposed to keeping everything that you produce. Because it's a very deep worldview. It's fundamental to those people. And there's not a lot of things that you can say that are going to change their attitude, because it's really deep set. Possibly there are religious arguments, and that also gets complicated. You can say to people, well, if you don't share, you're not going to heaven, or something like that. You can put pressure in emotional ways sometimes, but at heart, it's a really basic sense of who you are and what society is. Are you locked into a society that does a lot of cooperative sharing things so that the whole benefits, even though sometimes individuals who have more than others end up not having as much because they have to share it, versus a society where people are uneven and the ones who have a lot get to keep it all and prosper and be happy. I don't know. It's something I'm going to talk more about in the future, maybe on Friday. But for now, I'll leave it there and ask you to tell your friends about my videos, to please like and subscribe, and ask them to like and subscribe. And I'll see you on Friday. Have a good week.